How miserable is it up there, Jim?
We've got reports of 60-mile-an-hour winds, visibility of maybe 20 feet. It's a whiteout up there.
In May 1986, excitement coursed through the veins of the group at the Oregon Episcopal School as they hiked their way through the stunning terrain of Oregon's alpine regions toward the summit of Mount Hood. But little did this group of 20 know that what started as a thrilling annual excursion would rapidly spiral into a series of progressively worse events, culminating in a heart-wrenching tragedy that would shake their worlds to the core. What you're about to see is a story so awful that producers and movie executives were denied the rights to tell it. Today, we tell the facts about what happened that terrible day with respect and to honor the memories of those who lost their lives. Families eagerly and maybe even nonchalantly sent their kids on this trip every year, placing their trust in school leadership. But it would slowly turn into every parent's worst nightmare, a tragedy that would become the second worst alpine disaster to ever happen in North America. On the 11th of May, a Mother's Day, a party of 20 people gathered at the Oregon Episcopal School to gear up for a life-changing trip up Mount Hood. It was an hour before midnight, and everyone was looking forward to an exciting journey that would test their limits like never before. The idea was to climb the mountain within the next 12 hours, arriving by midday next day. They weren't aware that over the next 3 days, their limits would be tested to the absolute extreme, or that half of them wouldn't come back. The trip was part of a program run by Oregon Episcopal known as Base Camp, modeled after the principles of Outward Bound. Back then, it was actually a requirement for all 10th graders, and what 10th grader would say no to an adventure like this? The idea was to put students in a new environment that challenged their skills and forced them into a situation that required problem-solving and teamwork. The founder of Outward Bound explained that the experience of helping a fellow man in danger, or even of training in a realistic manner to be ready to give this help, tends to change the balance of power in a youth's inner life. However, the students that were part of this trip got more than they bargained for, with the events turning from a training scenario to a real-life disaster. The principles behind Outward Bound are safety, service, courage, leadership, diversity, and environmental stewardship. So you can imagine why the parents of these impressionable students were ready to send them up to Mount Hood, a mountain that has claimed the lives of 130 people. In the months leading up to the journey, instructors taught the students all the technical aspects of climbing a snowy mountain. They developed the ability to step kick during ascents, plunge step during descents, and execute a sitting glissade when navigating snow-covered slopes. Additionally, they familiarized students with self-arrest methods to ensure safety during potential falls and basic first aid knowledge to handle emergencies effectively while out on the mountain. So, with their knowledge and gear in hand, the students prepared to set out. Some of their gear included carabiners, seat harnesses, Prusik slings, a field stove, a sleeping bag, a large nylon tarp, and 2 first aid kits. In the investigation after the incident, it was found that more students should have had crampons issued, but those in charge felt that it would cause more harm than good without the proper training. Later, the team would be issued ice axes, helmets, and compasses, which are long, wand-like devices that are used to mark their path on the way up and down. A shovel was also issued, but, like the crampons, it was found that more shovels should have been issued for the number of people on the trip. The hour-and-a-half journey to Mount Hood from the campus began. In the front of the bus was 42-year-old Thomas Goman, the leader of the group, and the school's chaplain and Episcopal priest. He was a seasoned mountaineer and had adequate experience to lead the students in fair to moderate weather, but not in the kind of weather that they would find themselves in over the next disastrous days. Other adults that were part of the group were Marion Horwell and Sharon Spray, the only parent in the group who had come to accompany her daughter, Hillary. Marion was the dean of residence and student affairs at the school. She was a competent educator, but had never climbed a mountain in her life, adding to the inexperience of the group. 2 members would join the group at Timberline Lodge. Dee Znudiak, an outward bound instructor, and Ralph Summers, a professional guide. To add to the eeriness of this horrific true story, Timberline Lodge is where they filmed parts of the Shining horror film. 15 students, one mother, one priest, one administrator, and 2 guides arrived at Timberline Lodge to begin their climb up Mount Hood. 20 people went up the mountain that day, but only 11 of them would return. The beauty of Mount Hood is truly out of this world. The permanently snow-capped mountain is actually a dormant volcano, and it rises 11,239 feet above sea level. It has 12 permanent glaciers that have formed within the snow, creating deep crevices that pose the risk of a deadly fall. The sloped edges have the potential to cause avalanches, and the weather can turn into a nightmare within minutes. It might not look like much, but the apparent simplicity and beauty of the mountain lure people in without deep consideration of the dangers that they may face. The collection of excitable teens and their guides set out from Timberline Lodge at around 3 a.m. on Monday, the 12th of May, starting at an elevation of 6,000 feet. They were met with temperatures just above freezing, calf-deep snow, and an eerie silence, punctuated by the crunch of ice under their feet. When subjected to an environment like this, most people become quiet and just focus on placing one foot in front of the other. I know I certainly do. The 5,249-foot climb snakes up the eastern side of the Timberline ski area. The Palmer Chair, a popular ski lift, runs along the climb all the way up to 8,500 feet, where the route diverges to the summit. It takes climbers past well-known features like Crater Rock, Hogsback, and 2 rock towers near the summit, aptly named the Pearly Gates. So the group continued up to the summit. The temperatures may have been freezing, but so far the weather was stable and calm. The weather forecast predicted terrible conditions that day, but Thomas Goman, the group's priest and leader, had decided the climb could be completed safely anyway before the bad weather hit. This was the beginning of several fatal mistakes. As dawn came closer, many of the climbers started to have second thoughts about continuing, but Goman urged them to keep pushing. The first to head down were the mother and daughter duo, Sharon and Hillary Spray. Hillary complained of a tummy ache and later said that, "I was the first person to turn back. I did experience pressure from the leaders to continue. Tom Gorman pressured the kids. We all assumed he knew what was best. I knew that what was best for me was to turn around and leave." It turns out her stomach ache very likely saved her life. Later, her mother Sharon would talk about a moment she would never forget. The sight of the other climbers walking away, heading upward, the sounds of their movement growing fainter with each passing step. At 5 a.m., an hour behind schedule, the group was now at 7,000 feet, and they reached a warming station known as Silcock's Hut. Another student began suffering from cramps and asked Goman if she could turn back. Goman allowed her to return to the lodge, along with a friend to accompany her. At this point, the route down was still visible and easy to follow. This would change with the lingering snowstorm approaching. Just after they left Silcock's Hut, 2 other students decided to journey back down. The remaining group then reached Palmer Lift at 8 a.m., sitting at an elevation of 8,500 feet. Many more were discussing leaving, but the group still decided to push on through the windy, cold, yet seemingly stable weather. The posse kept pushing until 11:30 a.m., when Dee Znudiak, the outward bound guide and instructor, decided to head back. She was suffering from mild snow blindness, a condition caused by white snow reflecting the intense UV rays of the sun. She left by herself, bringing the group down to a total of 13 members. This was just after leaving the Hogsback section of the mountain at around 10,600 feet. In one of the only first-person written records of the climb, the professional guide, Ralph Summers, later recounted in a statement that the bad weather suddenly descended in the 2 hours after Dee Znudiak left, worsening visibility and picking up winds to near hurricane levels. To give you an idea of how quickly the weather can turn bad, Summers also reported being able to see both the summit and Timberline Lodge before they reached Hogsback just 2 hours prior. As the weather worsened, Summers seriously began to question whether they should turn around, yet they still trudged on through the harshening conditions. Goman believed they could still get to the summit and make it back down. Another set of decisions that would be fatal. At the time of the incident, Matt Zaffino was a young weatherman and meteorologist in Medford, Oregon. He summited Mount Hood on 2 occasions and stated that any veteran climber should know just how quickly the weather can turn deadly, explaining the importance of knowing Mount Hood's unpredictable weather patterns. When a storm like this hits, it hits fast. You're not just dealing with someone that's heading from point A to point B. Things are actually developing over your mountain. This means that a storm you thought was far away would suddenly be over your head before you knew it. In other words, Goman should have known this was the time to turn around. The conditions were starting to get to the worst of it, bringing heavy snowfall and sleet while reducing visibility to near zero. The freezing precipitation was driven by howling winds, creating blizzard-like conditions and wind chills well below zero. As the storm intensified, the temperature dropped even further, causing the snow to become more powdery and less stable, whipping it up violently. The extreme cold and high winds create an icy coating on exposed surfaces, making footing treacherous and increasing the risk of frostbite and hypothermia. The combination of low visibility, icy conditions, and frigid temperatures will also make navigation and rescue efforts incredibly difficult for the search teams. At around 11,000 feet, Summers decided to scout ahead alone, but only made it 30 or 40 feet before turning back. This is where he was finally able to convince Goman that the conditions were too treacherous for them to continue. When the distance between us increased to the limit of visibility, I decided to go back to the group. I told Tom that I thought we should get out of there. I told him to go to the front of the group and make sure they stayed in our tracks. Finally, the group turned around and started to head back down Mount Hood. However, by now, it was too late. This is where a bad situation started to turn much worse. The group was right in the middle of a howling storm, in a condition known as a whiteout. Visibility had dropped to 20 to 30 feet, and many of the members were starting to feel the debilitating effects of the severe weather system. One of these members was a young boy of 15 years old, Patrick McGinnis. He was the youngest in the group, and his lean runner's frame meant he had very little insulating fat to protect him from the harsh cold. At about 3:30 p.m., his speech slurred, and he started to topple over, wanting to go to sleep. This is what the beginning stages of extreme hypothermia looks like. By now, the group had descended several hundred feet and had made it back to the Hogsback portion of the climb. They clustered here to try to keep warm, but were unsure of their next decisions. You have to remember that once hypothermia starts to set in, your brain functioning becomes impaired, meaning most of the members were now operating at a level below their normal capacity. It's believed that the 2 leaders, Thomas Goman and Marion Horwell, were now suffering from the cognitive decline associated with hypothermia. This makes the next few actions even more heroic and echoes the best values of the base camp ideals. Everyone huddled around the struggling 15-year-old Patrick McGinnis in an attempt to warm him and placed him in the only sleeping bag they had brought along. Susan McClave, one of the seniors and more experienced climbers in the group, took off her jacket and shoes and climbed into the sleeping bag with McGinnis to spare some of her precious body heat. These efforts would unfortunately prove to be in vain. The team lost a lot of time in this process, with Summers dissolving 2 lemon drops in boiling water to give to McGinnis and the other 15-year-old Giles Thompson. They got moving back down the mountain after about an hour of trying to stabilize themselves. In an investigation led by climbing legend Jed Williamson, he confirmed that rewarming McGinnis was the right decision, but the group should have dug in at this point to keep everyone warm. The investigation also showed that 1 sleeping bag was just not enough for the whole group, and more should have been provisioned. In the American Alpine Club's summary of Williamson's investigation, they stated, "We can only speculate that there was the strong possibility that fatigue and the cold were affecting him adversely at a much earlier state than others in the group had become aware." As they continued their descent, Goman inadvertently led the group off course due to his declining mental state. Conditions had worsened now, with the wind howling at 40 knots and visibility at just under 10 feet. Ralph Summers and Susan McClave stepped into leadership roles as they were the most experienced of the bunch and weren't completely debilitated. Now off course and unable to pick up their trail, the group carried on trying to get down the mountain as best they could. However, they were now heading sideways along the face of the slope instead of straight down. As they went along, Summers noticed a crack in the snow, indicating that they were near the edge of a glacier. Glaciers are a one-way ticket to getting trapped between a literal rock and a hard place, with snow all around you. In Summers' statement after the climb, he put special emphasis on what he told the group to do next. I reminded the group to follow my footsteps and do not step on the crack. The group was led beyond the crack, but eventually ran into another. They were near the edge of the glacier at 8,200 feet. It was at this point that Summers decided there was no other option than to dig in and wait for the storm to pass or for help to arrive. Considering the late hour and the fact that we had one student that could not walk unassisted, not knowing our exact location, and finding ourselves on a glacier with at least one large crevasse, I considered it was our best option to dig in. I started digging a snow cave. It was now around 7 p.m. Goman and Summers began preparing a snow cave in the hopes they could keep everyone warm for the night. On the 13th of May, in the early hours of Tuesday morning, Mark Kelsey got a phone call, alerting him to a possible rescue situation on Mount Hood. Mark was part of the Portland Mountain Rescue Team and spent 17 years as a PMR volunteer, reaching the summit of Mount Hood over 460 times. He even has the coordinates of the deadly mountain tattooed on his arm, and he describes Mount Hood as pretty much my temple. Mark and other members of the PMR rescue team reached Timberline Lodge at around 5:21 a.m., carrying bags of gear that would be needed for the intense rescue operation they were about to undertake. With no idea of where the students were, they knew they were in for hours of searching through blizzard conditions, the likes of which none had seen before on Mount Hood. Mark later said that the conditions on that day were the worst he'd ever seen while on a search. In my whole climbing career, I never got frostbite except for that day. The first day of the rescue, the winds at the top of the Palmer chairlift were 103 miles per hour. Winds traveling at 103 miles per hour are classified as Category 2 hurricane. Meteorologist and weatherman Matt Zaffino said, "You can't even stand up in 100-mile-per-hour winds. If you do move, you can't even see where you're going. With blowing snow, you have zero visibility. Those are really, really dangerous conditions." Regardless, the rescue team came out to offer the best of what they could in these challenging conditions. After all, it was the students' lives on the line. PMR was the first to arrive, followed by the 304th Recovery Squadron, a team of Air Force para-rescuers. More teams arrived as the news spread of the disastrous situation unfolding on Mount Hood, some bringing Tucker snowcats, large all-terrain vehicles weighing more than 2 tons each, to assist in the recovery. Rescue teams ventured out into the weather, but with no idea where to search, the teens and their leaders were slowly running out of time. The whiteout meant no helicopter could fly, and winds became so severe they even flipped over a snowcat. Back on the mountainside, the outlook was not looking much better, with the condition of everyone slowly worsening. Even after a physically and mentally demanding day, Summers and Goman managed to dig a snow cave in about an hour. However, the floor space measured roughly 6 feet by 8 feet and was a mere 4 feet high. 6 people could comfortably fit in this, but the group needed to squeeze 13 souls into this tiny space. One by one, the group squeezed through the tiny opening, packing themselves along the walls of the makeshift cave. Once inside, new challenges started to arise. The walls began to thaw from all the body heat, so anyone in the center of the cave would be sitting in an icy bowl of freezing water. To make matters worse, the claustrophobic conditions meant the air was running out fast. One of the survivors later recounted how everyone was panicking about air. As panic overtook the group, a rotation was set up to keep the entrance to the cave open to allow airflow and prevent them from getting buried under the ever-falling snow. Goman spent much of the first night outside the cave, sitting in the storm. At some point, the wind blew away the shovel and sleeping bag, creating an unmanageable situation. With hope dwindling and everyone falling into a state of despair, Summers decided a new course of action was needed. He asked Goman to count to 10, and Goman wasn't able to. He determined that he had to leave and try to find the rescuers. In his statement, he wrote, "The only chance to keep alive and to get help for the group was to strike out and keep walking." A student named Molly Shula joined him, and the pair vanished into the whiteout, leaving 11 members behind in the freezing cave. As Molly and Summers descended, they found the much-needed shovel that had been blown away, but they knew that turning back now would be a death sentence for both of them. They kept moving, glissading down the steep slopes of Mount Hood, scraping by on the last bits of hope they had remaining. In an insane stroke of luck, Ralph Summers and Molly Shula made it to Mount Hood Meadows Lodge, a ski resort roughly 2 miles east of the Timberline Lodge and 3 miles southeast of the Snow Cave. They had veered far off course, but managed to save themselves regardless. Unfortunately, 11 people still remained in the dilapidated Snow Cave, thousands of feet higher. Suffering from exhaustion and just coming out of a blinding whiteout, Summers and Shula were unable to give rescuers a solid location of the Snow Cave. The 11 in the cave would still spend another 2 days struggling in the claustrophobic conditions. The American Alpine Club summary said, simply stated, events for the next 2 days involved a prolonged and valiant attempt on the part of the students to maintain the cave. There isn't a complete picture of what happened in the cave over the next 2 days, and it's probably better that the last horrifying moments of the group that passed in the cave did not come to light. It's estimated that on Tuesday night, Allison Litzenberger mustered up the strength and courage to go outside, prompting Aaron O'Leary and Eric Sandvik to follow her. On the same night, the rescue search was called off at 9 p.m. due to low visibility and harsh conditions. One of the survivors recalls Eric trying to climb back into the cave, but with the accumulation of snow, he was unable to get more than a single boot through the entrance. This left 3 students trapped outside in the storm, and 8 people buried within the belly of the mountain. Early on Wednesday morning, some hope started to shine on the rescuers' efforts. The weather cleared up at 2 a.m., giving them a chance to scout the situation with better visibility. Mark Kelsey's group was sheltered in a snowcat, and they rode up the slope from Mount Hood Meadows, following a similar route to what Summers and Molly descended. Just after sunrise at 5:45 a.m., Kelsey and his team confirmed some of the worst news imaginable. They noticed 2 black dots in a section known as the White River Canyon. Upon inspection, they discovered it was Allison Litzenberger and Aaron O'Leary. Kelsey said they were in the fetal position, one right above the other, the 2 at the bottom of the hill. Not in a position like they'd fallen, but in a position where they'd curled to stay warm. Their body temperatures were too low for them to survive the ordeal. Around the same time, a different crew of rescuers discovered a 3rd body, that of Eric Sandvik. After struggling to get back into the cave for what must have been hours, Eric collapsed into the snow. With no shelter in the worst of the storm, there was no way he could survive. He was almost directly on top of his peers, yet the rescue teams had no way of telling if the snow cave could be right underneath his body. Kelsey called in for a helicopter to recover those they had found, and they continued to probe for the snow cave. In a cruel miscommunication, the helicopter radioed to the base to prepare warm oxygen. This gave many the impression that the recovered bodies were still alive. A horrific false hope spread through the parents, only for this hope to later be crushed. Kelsey's team was then pulled off their line of search. Summers had gone up in a helicopter and redirected the search teams to a different location. Kelsey thinks he and his team must have been very close to the cave when they were moved, and they may have been only a few feet away. It was a perfect storm of mistakes, he says. 32 years later, remembering this day still makes Mark Kelsey emotional. Listen, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to try and do this, because I still remember getting off that helicopter, and all of the parents start moving in toward us. Just these faces of hope, of desperation. Give us something, please. And to have to not say anything, that was tough, because those people you just wanted to tell them, hold them, do something, but we weren't allowed to. There was a procedure for that. The search for Wednesday was coming to a close with no further developments, but one man had a hunch that likely saved the lives of 2 of the remaining students. A master sergeant named Richard Harder strongly believed they could still find the remaining climbers. Harder was part of the 304th Recovery Squadron and had the nickname Bagger because his first 24 missions ended without any live rescues. But this time, Bagger had a hunch that he could not ignore. He was convinced the team was wasting their time in their area of search, so he climbed into a Huey with a man named David McClure and soared to a height of 8,200 feet. He marked the area where he thought the cave would be with a smoke flare, and then radioed in that this is where the search should concentrate. His idea was met with resistance, as many believed the area had been covered thoroughly. The radio log notes, 10:33, the Bagger put smoke down an area of probable search. Field OL feels that they've covered marked area thoroughly. Later that afternoon, Bagger assembled a group of searchers, with Ralph Summers among them. They started at 8,500 feet and slowly moved down the slope of the mountain, pushing 10-foot avalanche poles into the snowy mountainside as they worked downward. At 5:38 p.m., 22 minutes before the scheduled end of the search for that day, his plan finally worked. Charlie Eck, a sergeant who was part of the 304th, hit something solid. Everyone started to dig frantically and were suddenly hit by a terrible smell. This meant they were on the right track. Pierre Bustanobi of the Seattle Mountain Rescue Council said one of the PJs stuck his head down, smelled the void, and said it had a bad smell. This immediately told us we were on target, and moments later we heard moaning coming from the main cave. The moaning was that of Brenton Clark. She was lying just beneath Giles Thompson at the entrance to the cave. These were the only two survivors left in the cave. Helicopters rushed the pair into the city to enact life-saving surgery. They had come inches from death. One physiologist said, "You have to understand what a heroic effort this was. These medical procedures demand massive resources. A single hospital rarely has the capacity to treat more than a few of these patients." Throughout May, June, and July, doctors fought to keep Thompson alive. They managed to do so, but he unfortunately lost his legs in the process. Brenton Clark made a full recovery and is now a doctor based out of Portland, Oregon. Like many of the survivors of this ordeal, she built her life around trying to heal others. Lorca Smetana, one of the climbers who left before the storm hit, said, "It's been my work ever since Mount Hood to somehow claim joy along with the pain, returning always to compassion, to resilience, arriving at peace by repairing, adapting, doing the work. And I will be remembered now more for the joy and compassion than for tragedy." We seem to think that time heals grief, but the truth is, it sticks with you for the rest of your life. You just find ways to manage it and deal with the load that has been left on your shoulders. Those who have been through trauma have to learn to integrate it into their worldview and sense of self. Mar Goman, Tom's wife, said, "At the time, I couldn't imagine how I would ever survive. I never thought my life would be good again. But I now see grief as a transformative part of living." There are many questions we can ask about that day. From the story and follow-up investigations, it's clear the grim weather warning was ignored, with Goman believing so strongly in the group that he thought they could push through the worst of it. There were many points at which the group should have turned around, but the desire to reach the summit was greater than the inclination to be cautious. Many aspects contributed to the demise of those 9 people that day, and we cannot assign blame to a single person on the trip. But it's clear Goman's recklessness was a factor. The lives of Patrick McGinnis, Tasha Amy, Marion Horwell, Susan McClave, Richard Hayter, Eric Sandvik, Tom Goman, Aaron O'Leary, and Allison Litzenberger will forever be remembered in Mount Hood's history. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and live brave.